Hello and welcome to my reading for today. Now, the book that I have chosen is The Titanic Detective Agency. It's a new book that I've recently discovered and it's recommended by lots of other teachers and lots of schools across the UK. And actually, I loved it because of being such a big fan of the Titanic and its history, so I just wanted to delve in a bit further. I'm going to be reading the first chapter today. Chapter 1. Bertha, 10th of April 1912. When the steam whistles blasted, Bertha jumped so hard she was almost catapulted off the deck. The whistle sounded again and she stuffed her fingers in her ears. Her mother wrapped her on the arm with the umbrella she'd insisted on carrying, in case of spring showers. "Stop that, dear. You'll ruin your new gloves and it doesn't look at all ladylike." Bertha turned from the rail and gave her mother a wicked grin. It might be ladylike in America, and so might whistling and climbing trees and spitting in the street. Her mother snorted in a rather unladylike fashion. "I hardly think so." But her mother didn't know. Neither of them knew how American ladies behaved. Her mother was as much at sea as she was. They didn't know the rules. Perhaps there were none. Bertha hugged herself, enjoying the warmth and softness of her new fur-lined coat. She could hardly wait. Her life was about to change. In America, everything was going to be different. Bertha leant over the rail, feeling giddy. The ground looked such a long way down. All around them, people were waving caps or handkerchiefs, calling farewells. Down on the quay, a massive crowd waved back, jostling for space, craning their necks to spot their friends and relatives, or simply to goggle at the size of the ship. But something else was going on. A group of men, kit bags on their shoulders, were pushing their way through the crowd, heading towards one of the gangways. They were yelling, waving their arms. "Oi! Hold on! We're coming aboard!" Bertha bent double over the rail. She might have toppled if Rosa Pinksy, who was sharing their cabin, hadn't grabbed her coat collar. "They're stokers by the looks of them," said Mrs. Pinksy, dismissively, as if stokers were unimportant, an optional extra on a steamship. "And they've had one too many beers in the public house, I expect." The men had reached the edge of the dock, but the officer shook his head, held them back with a raised arm. The lower gangway was pulled back and the would-be crew members were left stranded on the shore, shaking their fists, cursing. Bertha filed away their most colourful swear words, thinking they might be useful in her exciting new life. Behind her, Mrs. Pinksy gasped, and for a second, Bertha worried that she'd accidentally sworn aloud. It was far too soon. The ship hadn't even left the dock yet. They were still in Britain, with its million rules and regulations about how well brought-up girls should behave. "Do you see that?" asked Mrs. Pinksy in her wonderful exotic Polish-American accent. "One of those stokers dodged the officers. He's on the steerage gangway, see?" Bertha looked to where Rosa was pointing and saw a stocky man with fiery red hair shoving his way past the last of the third-class passengers, moving with such determination that he almost pushed a young lad into the water. As he reached the ship, the red-haired man stopped, looked back, and then vanished inside. "No wonder the rest are so annoyed," said Bertha's mother. "They have missed the boat, and no mistake." She beamed, enjoying her own joke. "It's a dreadful shame." Bertha clutched at her heart, imitating a film actress she'd seen at the Star Picture Palace. "Imagine how disappointed they must be. They thought they were about to start a fabulous new job on the finest ship in the world." "Shoveling coal into furnaces day and night isn't my idea of fabulous," snorted Ellen Toomey. "It'll be like the pits of hell down there in the boiler rooms." Bertha opened her mouth, about to tell Ellen that actually it was rude to interrupt, but closed it when she noticed her mother's warning frown. She had a sneaking suspicion Mrs. Toomey's interruptions might become a regular occurrence. The Irishwoman who was sharing their cabin too didn't seem to have much time for her, and they'd only been acquainted a matter of hours. But Bertha had no intention of allowing Ellen to spoil a single moment. She gave a heartfelt sigh. Those men were headed on a wonderful voyage across the Atlantic Ocean, and now the poor souls are going nowhere. The men's disappointment wasn't hard for her to imagine, because 3 days ago her mother had informed her that the ship they'd planned to travel on, the New York, wasn't going to sail after all because of coal strike. Bertha had been totally devastated. "We can't go back to Aberdeen," she wailed. "Please, you know we can't go back. We've sold the house. We've got to find a ship that will take us to America. Poor Daddy is all alone." This might have been true, but when Bertha had sobbed into her pillow that night, she hadn't wept for her father, who seemed from his letters to be perfectly happy and enjoying his work as an architect in Portland, Oregon. Her tears had been for her own crushed dreams. The run-up to leaving home had been hard. When she'd hugged her school friends goodbye, she'd been painfully aware that she'd probably never see them again. But even as she wept and promised to write, even when she'd handed over her precious collection of China dolls to her best friend Jean, excitement had been bubbling inside her, hot as magma. Her life was about to change. This was her big adventure. She was leaving all the greyness, cloudy skies, the granite buildings, her boring, humdrum life behind. In America, she could reinvent herself, or at least become a more confident, glamorous, grown-up version of herself. How could she bear to go back to resume her childish routine of school and church and Sunday school? She cried herself to sleep, distraught that the big adventure was over, when it had hardly begun. But yesterday, her life had been saved. She'd been in the parlour of her uncle's London townhouse, playing a game of marbles with her 3 cousins, while trying to eavesdrop on her mother and aunt's conversation, when the door had been flung open and her uncle barged in, beaming and waving 2 large pieces of paper. "Oh, Bessie, you're in luck! I've got a passage on a new ship for you, and I mean a new ship. Brand spanking new. This trip to New York will be her maiden voyage. Have you guessed the name of it?" He handed her mother the ticket with a flourish, as if she were the queen. Then he'd given Bertha hers, with a rather less ceremony. She'd examined it, reading aloud, excitement and nerves bubbling in her stomach. "I don't believe it. We're travelling on the finest steamer in the world." Her uncle had laughed, enjoying her reaction. "So say the White Star Line. They're all calling her the queen of their fleet." He turned back to Bertha's mother. "And the newspapers have declared her practically unsinkable. You'll be relieved to hear that, Bessie, I'm sure." Bertha had glanced at her mother, suddenly anxious. The possibility of the ship sinking hadn't even occurred to her, but her mother had smiled as wide as the ocean. She'd flung her arms around her brother's neck. Thank you so much. James will be so relieved. Our wee family has been apart for 6 months, and thanks to you, we'll be all together at last. Look, Bertha! The ship leaves tomorrow. Finally, we're off to New York." Bertha's fingers had trembled as they traced the black letters. RMS Titanic. We're leaving. The big adventure is actually happening. Dull, mousy me is getting left behind. Goodbye, boring wee Bertha. Howdy, Roberta Watt, pioneering adventuress. As boarding finished and the crew began hauling up the lines, Bertha felt excitement building in her chest. The steam whistle sounded again, signalling to the group of tugboats which chugged around the massive ship. Slowly, majestically, the Titanic began to move away from berth number 44. "We're off," she breathed, tugging at her mother's sleeve. "We're going to see Daddy at last. Do you think he'll recognise me?" Her mother tutted. She was a sensible, level-headed woman who didn't have time for dramatics and even less for hysteria. She was determined that Bertha would indulge in neither, but was often disappointed. "Stop your nonsense, Bertha. Of course he will." Ellen Toomey must have overheard, because she stopped chatting to Mrs. Pinksy, pointed at Bertha and laughed, a harsh bark like a fox's. "Your daddy will recognise you by those teeth in an instant." Heat burned Bertha's cheeks. Her hand flew to her face, covering her mouth. "Tosh! He will know you by that beautiful auburn hair." Rosa Pinksy's sympathetic eyes only made Bertha feel worse. "And by those lovely dark eyes." There was an almighty bang. Ellen Toomey screeched like a barn owl, and Bertha's first thought was that Ellen deserved her fright for being so mean. But then fear gripped her too, because she could see something terrible was happening. One of the docked ships seemed to have broken its moorings. It was drifting across the water, pulled towards the Titanic like iron filings to a magnet. "Gracious!" gasped her mother. "The New York is coming straight for us!" When even her mother sounded alarmed, Bertha knew they were in big trouble. Her heart banged against her ribs as she watched the stern of the American liner swing towards the Titanic. It seemed deeply strange that the ship they'd originally booked for their voyage, the ship that was going nowhere, was now drifting ever closer. One way or another, the New York seemed determined to stop her from travelling. What if the newspapers are wrong? What if the ship sinks and we all have to swim to shore? What if my mother decides she'd had enough adventure and takes me back to Aberdeen? Tears stung her eyes and she wiped them away with her glove. It wasn't that she disliked Ashley Road School. The teachers were strict but fair, and she'd excelled at gymnastics and creative writing. But she'd said all her goodbyes. She'd cut the cords that had bound her to school and home and Belmont Congregational Church. She was ready to fly, or at least to set sail, as her mother had laughed at Bertha's suggestion they go by airship. Don't be silly, dear. Those dirigibles are far too dangerous for transatlantic crossings. We'll be much safer on an ocean liner. Bertha wondered if those words were echoing in her mother's head at this very moment. The New York was only feet from them. A collision seemed inevitable. When Bertha looked over the rail at the frothy grey waves heaving below her, nausea rose in her throat and she breathed a silent prayer. Please, God, I want to get to America. I don't want to go home. Please don't let this be the end.